V. For most of your life, you have probably believed that eating at fixed times is a sign of order. Breakfast in the morning, lunch at midday, dinner in the evening. A quiet rhythm that feels natural, almost biological. But for nearly all of human history, this rhythm did not exist. Food did not arrive on schedule, hunger did not follow the clock, and the human body did not expect to be fed 3 times a day. What now feels stable may, in a longer view, be something the body is still learning to tolerate, not something it was built around. If that is true, then a simple daily habit might not be as ancient as it feels. Why 90% of human history never ate 3 fixed meals a day? Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video. The knowledge ahead will be worth it. For most people today, waking up is quietly tied to the expectation of eating, as if the body has been waiting through the night for a predictable moment of replenishment. And as morning light appears, food follows almost automatically, creating a sequence that feels stable and deeply familiar, repeated day after day until it begins to feel not just routine, but necessary. This sense of necessity is subtle, rarely questioned, because it fits so smoothly into modern life where food is stored, accessible, and organized into clear moments across the day. But when this pattern is placed against the much longer span of human history, it begins to shift, and what once felt inevitable starts to look more like a recent arrangement layered onto a far older way of living that did not depend on fixed timing. In early human environments, waking did not guarantee access to food, and the first moments of the day were not structured around a prepared meal but around awareness, movement, and the changing conditions of the surrounding world. Light returned gradually. Temperatures rose or fell depending on the season, and the landscape revealed what had changed overnight, and the body responded first to these signals rather than to a fixed expectation of eating. Hunger, in this setting, did not point toward a scheduled solution, but existed as a quiet condition that could continue while the day began to unfold, without urgency, without a defined endpoint, and without the assumption that food should immediately follow. The human body, shaped across many generations before agriculture and storage systems became reliable, did not depend on immediate intake after waking in order to begin functioning. It could stand, walk, observe, and engage with the environment while still in a state of mild emptiness, drawing on stored energy and adjusting its pace to what was available. This flexibility becomes clearer when we consider that, for most of human existence, food was not waiting in a known place at a known time. It had to be found, gathered, or obtained through effort, and sometimes it was simply not available in the early part of the day, or not available at all. If something remained from the previous day, it might be eaten, but this depended entirely on circumstance rather than routine, and there was no shared expectation that morning should always begin with food. Over long periods, this meant that some mornings included eating, while others passed without it, and the body adjusted to this variation without requiring consistency, without signaling failure, and without needing the stability that modern patterns now provide. When agriculture slowly began to change human life, allowing people to remain in one place and produce food more predictably, the conditions for regular eating became more possible, but even then, the formation of a fixed morning meal required more than availability. It required repetition, shared timing, and a gradual alignment between daily life and structured hours, something that developed slowly over generations rather than appearing all at once. Only much later, as time itself became measured more precisely and daily schedules became more standardized, did the idea of eating soon after waking become common enough to feel natural and expected. Even now, that feeling of naturalness may come less from deep biological necessity and more from repeated cultural reinforcement, quietly shaping behavior until it feels like something the body has always known. Looking back toward the earliest human conditions, the morning appears less like the beginning of a scheduled intake and more like an open period shaped by uncertainty, where the presence or absence of food was simply one possibility among many, and the body remained capable of continuing without immediate resolution, moving forward before eating, rather than eating before beginning. The modern morning meal feels so ordinary that it is easy to mistake it for a biological instruction, as though the body wakes with a built-in request for breakfast, and the day cannot properly begin until that request is answered. Yet this feeling becomes less certain when we imagine the conditions under which human life first took shape. In landscapes where food was unevenly distributed, quickly spoiled, and rarely arranged in a form that allowed the same response every morning. For early humans, waking was not followed by the quiet certainty of stored bread, cooked grains, or prepared leftovers waiting in a familiar place. Morning began inside an environment that had to be read again each day. The air could be colder than expected, the ground could be wet, the previous day's opportunities could be gone, and the search for food might begin only after movement, observation, and contact with the wider surroundings. In that setting, the body did not treat the first light of day as a signal that eating must now occur. It treated morning as a continuation of survival, and eating remained dependent on what the world allowed. This matters because a habit repeated in modern life can easily feel ancient, even when the deeper human past suggests something more flexible. The body is capable of associating certain times with hunger, but that is not the same as proving those times are original. Hunger can be trained by repetition. It can begin to appear when food usually appears. A person who eats every day at the same hour often feels the body preparing for that hour, but this learned rhythm should not be confused with a timeless design carried unchanged from the beginning of our species. In older human settings, the body would have had to tolerate a looser pattern. Food might arrive early on one day, later on another, and not in equal amounts. Morning hunger, when it came, did not guarantee satisfaction. It was simply one part of being alive in an uncertain environment. This older pattern is easier to understand when we look not only at biology, but also at material conditions. Before reliable storage, before kitchens, before fixed dwellings organized around predictable domestic routines, the idea of dividing the day into named meals had little support in daily life. A society cannot easily maintain 3 fixed meals when access to food remains unstable and the timing of effort keeps changing with season, weather, migration, and local resources. Even after humans began farming, the path toward fixed meals was gradual. Agriculture made certain foods more available, but it did not instantly create the modern habit of breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the strict sense now familiar to many people. Fields, labor, preservation, social customs, and later clock-based time all had to develop together before eating could become synchronized across the day. The body then adapted to that pattern because human life had changed around it, not because the pattern had always been there waiting to be expressed. When viewed from this longer perspective, the modern morning meal begins to look less like an ancient inheritance and more like the result of settled life, stored food, repeated schedules, and shared social timing. The deeper human past suggests not a body that demanded food at a fixed morning hour, but a body that could continue through uncertainty, adjusting to variation without assuming that sunrise and eating belong together. What feels natural now may be real as a present habit, but still much younger than it seems, and much more dependent on civilization than on the oldest conditions in which human beings first learned how to remain alive. A fixed morning meal also depends on something modern life rarely notices anymore, which is the quiet presence of control. Food is nearby, time is divided clearly, and the day begins inside a protected space where eating can happen almost immediately. This control is so common now that it can seem invisible, but across most of human history, daily life began in a very different relationship with the world. Morning did not open inside a sealed environment where hunger could be answered at once. It opened into weather, distance, uncertainty, and the simple fact that the body often had to enter the day before it could be fed. In that older setting, waking and eating were not tightly joined together. They were often separated by movement, by searching, by waiting, and by whatever conditions the landscape allowed. This does not mean early humans were constantly starving, and it does not mean they never ate early. It means the pattern itself was unstable. Some mornings may have included food from the night before, some may have offered quick access to gathered plants or leftovers, and some may have passed with little or nothing at all. The important point is not a single rule, but the absence of a dependable schedule. The body that emerged through those long conditions was not one that could only function after a fixed morning meal. It was one that could begin the day in a state of uncertainty and continue anyway. That older flexibility becomes easier to see when we think about how deeply the modern idea of breakfast depends on settled life. A regular meal after waking assumes more than hunger. It assumes storage, repeated timing, familiar tools, domestic space, and a social habit strong enough to be repeated across days. These things did not exist in the same stable way for most of human history. Long before cities, long before kitchens organized the morning, and long before clocks divided the day into expected points of intake, the human body was already human. It was already waking, moving, deciding, and enduring. This matters because it shifts the question away from what feels normal now and back toward what the body first learned to tolerate. In those early environments, mild morning emptiness was not necessarily a disruption. It could simply be part of the beginning of the day. The body could carry it while walking, scanning, gathering, or waiting for a better opportunity. Even in later historical periods, once farming had spread in many places, eating patterns still varied with labor, season, class, local custom, and access to stored food. A strict 3-meal structure was not universal, and even where daily routines became more stable, they did not all look the same. That is why the modern arrangement can feel older than it really is. It is repeated so consistently that it creates the impression of permanence. Yet the deeper record of human life suggests something looser and more adaptive, where food followed circumstance more often than the clock. Seen this way, breakfast begins to look less like an ancient human constant and more like a late expression of order, made possible by systems that arrived long after the body itself. The first humans did not wake into a world arranged around meal times. They woke into a world that had to be faced before it could be organized. The morning, in that longer human story, was not a protected eating window. It was an uncertain threshold between darkness and effort, and the body learned to cross it without assuming that food would be waiting on the other side. In modern life, hunger often seems to arrive on time, as if it has learned to follow the clock just as closely as the rest of the day. People begin to feel a quiet emptiness in the morning, a return of appetite around midday, and a familiar pull again in the evening. And this repeating pattern can give the impression that the body itself is keeping time, asking for food at fixed intervals as part of its natural design. Yet this sense of regularity becomes less certain when we look beyond the structure of modern schedules and consider the longer conditions under which the human body developed. For most of human history, there was no shared clock dividing the day into equal segments, no consistent routine that could be repeated across generations in the same precise way, and no guarantee that food would appear at the same moments from one day to the next. In those earlier environments, hunger did not have a stable external reference point. It could rise and fall according to energy use, previous intake, temperature, and the unpredictable presence or absence of food, rather than aligning with specific hours. The body responded to internal conditions first, not to a fixed schedule imposed from outside. This distinction matters because it suggests that what feels like timed hunger today may not be a direct reflection of ancient biology, but partly the result of repeated patterns shaping perception over time. When food is regularly consumed at similar hours each day, the body can begin to anticipate those moments, preparing digestion and signaling appetite in advance. Over time, this anticipation can feel automatic, as though hunger itself has become synchronized with the clock. But anticipation is not the same as origin. It can be learned, reinforced, and adjusted, depending on the structure of daily life. In earlier human settings, such reinforcement would have been far less consistent. A day might involve long periods of movement without food, followed by a sudden opportunity to eat, or smaller, scattered moments of intake that did not divide neatly into distinct meals. Hunger, in that context, would not need to arrive at predictable times, because the environment did not reward predictability. It rewarded flexibility. The human body, shaped under those conditions, developed the ability to continue functioning through variation, rather than relying on evenly spaced intake to maintain stability. This flexibility can be observed in the way the body manages energy across time. When food is not immediately available, stored energy can be used, activity can continue, and hunger can remain present without becoming overwhelming in the short term. This does not mean that food was unimportant, or that extended absence had no consequences, but it does suggest that the body was not dependent on strict timing in order to begin or sustain daily activity. Instead, it could move between states of intake and absence, adjusting to what was possible rather than what was planned. Looking back toward the earliest phases of human life, before agriculture, before permanent settlements, and before systems that could stabilize daily routines. This pattern of flexible hunger appears as a reasonable response to the world as it was. Food sources changed with season, location, and chance. Some days offered abundance, others offered little, and the body learned to operate across that uneven landscape without expecting regular intervals of consumption. As human societies became more structured, especially with the spread of farming and later with the organization of labor around fixed hours, eating patterns gradually aligned with external time. Hunger began to follow those patterns, not because it had always done so, but because daily life had become stable enough to support repetition. In modern conditions, this alignment is so consistent that it can feel as though hunger itself belongs to the clock. Yet beneath that surface, the deeper history of the human body suggests something less rigid, where hunger did not arrive on schedule, and where the absence of food at a particular hour did not represent a disruption, but simply another variation in a long pattern of uncertainty that the body was already prepared to endure. If hunger does not naturally belong to the clock, then its shape begins to look different when placed inside the older conditions of human life, where time was not divided into fixed segments, and where eating could not be guaranteed at any particular moment. In that setting, hunger was not a signal that pointed toward a specific hour, but a more fluid experience that rose and softened depending on what the body had recently used and what the environment allowed. A person might feel hunger early in the day, but there would be no clear expectation that it would be satisfied soon. That feeling could continue through movement, through searching, through waiting, and sometimes through the entire morning without resolution. The body did not treat this as a failure of timing, because there was no timing to fail. Instead, hunger became something that could exist alongside activity, not something that had to be answered before the day could begin. This difference becomes clearer when we consider that early humans lived within landscapes that changed from day to day in small but meaningful ways. Food sources shifted with weather, with the movement of animals, with the ripening of plants, and with the availability of water. Even when a location had been reliable before, it could not always be counted on to provide again at the same moment. Because of this, hunger could not be synchronized with a repeating pattern. It had to remain adaptable, able to stretch across time without immediate fulfillment. The human body, developing under these conditions, did not rely on evenly spaced intake to maintain stability. It learned to adjust its use of energy, to continue functioning when food was delayed, and to respond when opportunities appeared rather than when the clock suggested they should. This does not imply that hunger was ignored or unimportant, but it suggests that its role was different. It was not a command tied to a fixed hour, but a signal that existed within a broader context of uncertainty. Over time, this created a rhythm that was shaped more by the environment than by internal scheduling. Some days might involve earlier intake, others later, and many would not follow a consistent pattern across successive mornings. This variability is also reflected in the way food might be consumed when it did become available. Eating did not always occur in neatly separated portions that could be labelled as meals. Instead, intake could happen in uneven amounts, sometimes clustered, sometimes spaced, depending on what had been found and what could be carried or shared. This further reduced the possibility of linking hunger to specific moments, because the body was not being trained to expect equal intervals between distinct eating events. As human societies gradually became more stable, especially with the spread of agriculture and the development of more predictable food supplies, the conditions began to change. It became possible to eat at similar times each day, and over generations, this repetition allowed hunger to begin aligning with those times. The body adapted, not because it had always functioned that way, but because the environment had become structured enough to support a new pattern. In modern life, where time is measured precisely and food is available with little delay, this alignment feels complete. Hunger seems to arrive on schedule, reinforcing the idea that it has always belonged there. But when viewed against the longer human past, it appears more like a surface layer, shaped by recent conditions, resting on top of a deeper capacity for flexibility that once allowed the body to move through the day without expecting food to appear at fixed and predictable hours. When hunger is placed back into the older conditions of human life, it begins to lose the sense of precision that modern routines have given it, and instead becomes something slower, less defined, and more closely tied to the changing state of the body rather than to any external measure of time. In a world without clocks, without fixed schedules, and without guaranteed access to food, the body could not rely on exact intervals to guide its expectations. It had to operate within a range, responding to shifts in energy, effort, and availability, rather than waiting for a particular hour to arrive. This meant that hunger could appear, remain present, soften, and return again without ever being anchored to a predictable pattern. A person might wake with a mild sense of emptiness, begin moving through the landscape, and continue for a long period before encountering food, and during that time, the feeling of hunger would not necessarily intensify in a straight line or demand immediate resolution. It could settle into the background of activity, becoming part of the ongoing state of the body rather than a signal that required instant action. This ability to continue despite hunger reflects a form of flexibility that would have been necessary in environments where food could not be summoned on demand. The body had to balance its use of stored energy with the uncertainty of future intake, allowing for movement and decision-making even when nourishment was delayed. From a biological perspective, this suggests that hunger is not a simple on-off signal tied to fixed timing, but a more gradual and adjustable process, influenced by previous intake, physical effort, and environmental conditions. In early human settings, where these factors varied constantly, hunger would have followed a pattern that was equally variable, rising and falling in ways that did not align with evenly spaced meals. This variability can also be understood through the lens of daily movement. Before the development of settled life, much of the day could involve walking, searching, observing, and interacting with the environment, and these activities were not arranged around planned eating times. Instead, eating had to fit into the flow of movement, often occurring when an opportunity appeared rather than when a schedule allowed. This further reduced the likelihood that hunger would become synchronized with specific moments, because the body was not receiving food at consistent intervals that could train it to expect regular intake. Over long periods, this created a relationship between hunger and time that was flexible rather than fixed, allowing the body to function across a wide range of conditions without requiring strict patterns. As human societies gradually introduced more stability through agriculture, storage, and later through structured daily routines, the relationship between hunger and time began to change. Repeated eating at similar hours allowed the body to anticipate food, and over generations, this anticipation became more noticeable, giving the impression that hunger naturally follows the clock. Yet this impression rests on a relatively recent alignment between internal signals and external structure. Beneath it remains the older capacity to adjust, to continue when food is delayed, and to operate without relying on evenly spaced intake. This deeper layer is not always visible in modern life, because the conditions that once required it are less common, but it still reflects the long history of a body shaped in environments where hunger did not arrive on schedule and where the absence of food at a particular time was not unusual. When viewed in this way, the modern experience of hunger begins to look less like a fixed rule and more like a pattern shaped by repetition, one that feels stable now, but rests on a much older foundation of flexibility that allowed early humans to live through days that did not follow the steady rhythm of 3 meals, but instead moved through time in a quieter, less predictable way, where hunger was simply part of the background of being alive rather than a signal tied to a specific hour. The idea of eating at fixed times depends on a kind of environmental stability that is so common today it often goes unnoticed, yet for most of human history, that stability did not exist in a consistent or reliable form. The natural world that early humans moved through was not arranged to provide food at regular intervals, and it did not respond to need with predictable timing. Instead, it shifted continuously, sometimes in subtle ways across days, and sometimes more dramatically across seasons, creating conditions where the presence of food could not be assumed at any specific moment. In such an environment, the concept of dividing the day into evenly spaced meals would have had little practical meaning, because the world itself did not support that kind of structure. Morning could begin with abundance in one place and absence in another, and even within the same location, what was available one day might not appear again the next. This instability was not an exception, but a normal feature of life before systems of storage, farming, and distribution became widespread. When we imagine those conditions, the connection between time and eating begins to loosen. A fixed meal requires more than hunger. It requires the repeated alignment of availability, effort, and expectation. and that alignment depends on an environment that can deliver similar outcomes across many days. In early human settings, that alignment was difficult to maintain. Weather changed the behavior of plants and animals, movement across landscapes altered access to resources. Periods of abundance could be followed by quieter periods where less was found. Because of this, eating followed opportunity rather than the clock. The body responded to what appeared, not to what was planned. This pattern can be seen not only in biological terms, but also in the material traces that remain from earlier human activity. Evidence from different regions suggests variation in diet, timing, and access, rather than a single repeated structure applied uniformly across time. While it is not possible to reconstruct exact daily schedules, the broader picture points toward flexibility rather than strict routine. Food was gathered, hunted, or collected when it could be, and the timing of these events depended on conditions that were constantly changing. Even as humans began to settle more permanently and cultivate plants, the environment continued to influence eating patterns. Early farming did not eliminate uncertainty. Harvests could vary, preservation methods were limited, and the rhythm of labor often shaped when food could be prepared and consumed. In many cases, eating still followed work and availability more than a fixed division of the day. It took long periods of gradual change before food could be produced, stored, and distributed in ways that allowed consistent daily timing to become possible. Only when these conditions became more stable did the idea of regular meals begin to take hold, supported by repeated access and shared routines. Looking back toward the deeper past, the absence of this stability becomes more visible. The environment did not provide food on a schedule, and the human body, living within that environment, did not develop under conditions that required strict timing. Instead, it adapted to a world where variation was expected, and where eating was shaped by what the landscape allowed at each moment. The modern pattern of fixed meals, including the expectation of eating at certain hours each day, rests on a foundation of environmental control that did not exist for most of human history. What now feels orderly and dependable may reflect a relatively recent relationship between humans and their surroundings, one in which the unpredictability of nature has been partially reduced, allowing time to organize eating in a way that would have been difficult to maintain in the earlier, less stable world where human life first began to unfold. Environmental instability did not only affect whether food existed in a general sense, it also affected where food could be found, how long it remained useful, and whether the effort needed to obtain it made sense on a given day. This is important, because a fixed meal pattern depends on more than having something edible somewhere in the landscape. It depends on food being near enough, safe enough, and reliable enough to support repetition. For most of human history, these conditions were weak or uneven. A place that offered useful plants in one season might offer very little in another. Water sources could shift. Animal movement could change with temperature, rain, or migration. What had been worth searching for yesterday might not be worth the same effort today. In such a world, the body did not wake into a stable system of supply. It woke into a question. The day began not with certainty, but with the need to read the surroundings again. This helps explain why eating could not easily settle into fixed daily slots. A fixed meal assumes that the environment has already been made predictable before the body even asks for food. But early human life was not built on that kind of predictability. It was built on adjustment. People moved through environments that changed in small ways all the time, and those small changes mattered. A patch of land could be less productive. A familiar route could take longer. A resource could appear in limited amounts and then disappear. Even when food was present, it could require time, labor, and cooperation before it became edible. That creates a very different pattern from the modern one, where eating is often separated from the effort of obtaining food. Today, a person may feel hungry and solve that feeling within minutes. In the older human world, hunger and access were often separated by distance, by work, and by uncertainty. This gap between wanting food and reaching food is one of the quiet facts that made fixed meals difficult across most of human history. The environment did not respond to appetite with regular timing. It responded according to season, landscape, and chance. This also shaped the body's relationship with time. If food cannot be trusted to appear at the same hour, then the body gains little by attaching hunger too tightly to exact moments. A more flexible response makes more sense. Mild hunger can be carried, energy can be used carefully. Activity can continue while the search goes on. This is not a dramatic story of constant hardship. It is a slower point. The body was formed in a world where regular eating could not always be protected, so it remained able to function across variation. Looking toward the early origin of human life makes this even clearer. Long before villages, storage rooms, and settled kitchens, humans were already living in open environments where food was part of the landscape, not part of a timed system. That older beginning matters because it places the body inside a world that did not care about meal hours. It offered opportunities, not schedules. Even later, when agriculture began to change some human communities, environmental instability did not suddenly disappear. Crops still depended on weather. Harvests still varied. Stored food could still run low. This means the path toward regular meals was slow and incomplete, shaped over long stretches of history rather than appearing all at once. When seen from this longer view, fixed meals begin to look less like an ancient human pattern and more like a result of unusual stability, the kind of stability that only became common after people gained much greater control over land, food, and daily time. For most of the human story, the environment remained too changeable to support that level of regularity, and eating continued to follow what the world allowed, not what the clock suggested. What makes the natural environment so important in this question is not simply that food was sometimes scarce, but that the world itself resisted repetition. A fixed meal pattern depends on a repeated setting, where similar conditions return often enough for the body and the group to build expectation around them. For most of human history, that repeated setting was weak. The land changed with season, with temperature, with rainfall, with the movement of animals, and with the brief appearance and disappearance of useful plants. Even within the same region, the difference between one part of the year and another could be enough to alter when food could be found, how much effort it required, and whether it could be eaten at once or had to wait. This meant that eating could not easily become a stable daily structure, because the environment kept interrupting any attempt at regularity. The body did not live inside a system that promised food at morning, midday, and evening. It lived inside a wider rhythm that belonged to the landscape first. This becomes easier to see when we imagine how much of early human life depended on direct contact with the surrounding world. Food was not abstract. It was not a category sitting on a shelf. It was tied to places, seasons, traces, weather, and timing that humans did not fully control. A location that seemed generous one week might offer much less later. A route that usually led toward water or edible plants could become less useful after changes in climate or movement. A hunting opportunity might come suddenly and then not return for some time. In that setting, regular meals were difficult not because people lacked awareness or discipline, but because the world kept shifting beneath them. The day could not be divided neatly when the environment itself refused neat division. This older condition also helps explain why the human body seems capable of carrying mild hunger without immediately stopping. Across long stretches of time, the body did not need a perfect food rhythm. It needed enough flexibility to keep moving through uncertainty. That flexibility would have mattered at the beginning of the human story, long before settled fields, long before permanent kitchens, and long before food could be separated from weather and distance. The earliest human environments did not offer a protected routine. They offered variation, and the body remained alive inside that variation by adjusting rather than expecting. Even after some communities began to farm, the environment still kept much of its power. Crops did not erase uncertainty. They depended on rain, soil, labor, storage, and luck across the season. A field might promise future food, but it did not create the modern experience of total daily reliability. For a long time, people still lived close to fluctuation, and eating patterns still reflected that closeness. Only much later, when human societies gained stronger control over production, preservation, and daily scheduling, could the environment be shaped enough to support meals that happened at the same hours again and again. That is why the modern pattern can feel older than it truly is. It is built on layers of stability that were absent for most of the human past. Seen from this longer view, the natural world was not the background to fixed meals. It was the reason fixed meals were so difficult to maintain. The body that came through that long history was not formed in a world of regular feeding windows, but in a world where food followed changing conditions, and where the day had to remain open because the land itself would not stay still long enough to make certainty possible. In modern life, it often feels natural to eat first and begin moving later, as if energy must be placed into the body before the day can properly start. And this sequence appears so stable that it is rarely questioned. A person wakes, prepares food, eats, and then steps into activity with the sense that movement depends on what has just been consumed. This pattern is supported by an environment where food is immediately available, and where the effort of obtaining it has already been separated from the act of eating. But when we look back toward the earlier conditions in which the human body developed, the order of events begins to look very different. Movement did not wait for food. It often came before it. The day began not with preparation, but with engagement, with stepping into a world that had to be navigated before any certainty of eating could exist. In those environments, the body could not rely on a morning meal as a starting point, because food was not guaranteed to be present at the moment of waking. Instead, waking led into movement, and movement led, if conditions allowed, toward food. This reversal changes the way we understand the relationship between eating and activity. Rather than eating in order to move, early humans often moved in order to eat. The search for food required walking, scanning, remembering locations, and responding to what the environment revealed. Sometimes this process took time, and during that time the body continued to function without immediate intake. This suggests that the body was capable of beginning the day using energy already available within it, rather than depending on a fresh supply at a fixed hour. The capacity to move before eating reflects a form of adaptation shaped by necessity. When food cannot be summoned on demand, movement becomes the condition that makes eating possible, not something that follows it. This does not mean that early humans never ate before activity, but it does mean that the pattern could not be fixed in the way it often is today. Some days might begin with food if something remained from the previous day or could be obtained quickly, but many days would begin with movement first, because that was the only way to reach what was needed. This pattern becomes clearer when we consider the broader setting of early human life, where the boundary between effort and reward was much closer than it is now. Food was not separated from its source by systems of storage, transport, and preparation that removed the need for immediate action. Instead, the act of eating was often directly linked to the act of finding or obtaining food, and this link meant that movement naturally came before consumption. Over long periods, the human body developed within this relationship, learning to function across the early part of the day without requiring immediate intake, and adjusting its pace to the conditions of the environment rather than to a fixed internal schedule. As human societies gradually changed, especially with the development of agriculture and later with more structured forms of daily life, this relationship began to shift. Food could be produced in advance, stored, and accessed without the same level of effort, and this allowed eating to move earlier in the day, sometimes before movement rather than after it. Over time, this shift became more common, and eventually it formed part of the modern routine, where eating first feels like the natural order. Yet this order depends on a set of conditions that were not present for most of human history. It depends on stability, on storage, on proximity, and on the separation of food from the effort required to obtain it. When these conditions are removed, the older pattern becomes visible again, where the body begins the day in motion, not in consumption, and where the path toward eating is shaped by what the environment allows rather than by what the clock suggests. Seen in this way, the modern sequence of eating before moving appears less like an original design and more like a rearrangement made possible by a controlled environment, layered onto a much longer history in which movement was the first step, and eating followed only when the world made it possible. When movement comes before eating, the relationship between the body and food becomes shaped by distance, time, and effort in a way that is difficult to notice from within modern life. Today, a person can feel hunger and respond almost immediately, often without needing to leave a room, without needing to search, and without needing to invest physical effort before food becomes available. This closeness between desire and access creates the impression that eating naturally belongs at the beginning of the day, as if the body expects to be supplied before anything else begins. But in earlier human settings, this closeness did not exist in a reliable way. Hunger and access were often separated by space and by uncertainty, and that separation meant that the body could not depend on immediate intake as a starting condition for movement. Instead, movement became the bridge between the two. The day opened, the body began to move, and only through that movement could food eventually be reached, if it could be reached at all. This creates a quieter but important shift in how we understand daily life. Eating was not the beginning of activity, it was often the outcome of it. The body, shaped under those conditions, needed to operate through the early part of the day using what was already available internally, rather than waiting for a new supply to arrive at a fixed hour. This ability to begin without immediate intake reflects a deeper pattern that connects the body to its original environment. Early humans did not wake into a prepared system that could deliver food on demand. They woke into landscapes that had to be explored again, where the distance to food could change from one day to the next, and where the effort required to obtain it could vary in ways that could not be predicted in advance. In such a setting, it would have been difficult to maintain a consistent sequence where eating always came first. Sometimes food might be found quickly, but often it required time, and during that time, movement was unavoidable. This does not suggest that early humans lived in constant strain, but it does suggest that the structure of the day was organized differently. Movement was not an optional activity placed after eating. It was a necessary part of reaching food, and therefore it often came before it. Over many generations, this pattern would have shaped how the body uses and manages energy. Rather than requiring immediate replenishment after waking, the body could rely on stored energy for a period, allowing activity to begin without interruption. This is not a claim that eating was unimportant, but a recognition that the timing of eating was flexible, shaped by what could be reached rather than by what was expected. As human societies became more settled, especially with the development of agriculture, and later with systems that allowed food to be stored and accessed easily, this relationship began to change. The distance between hunger and food decreased. The effort required to obtain food became less immediate. Over time, eating could move closer to the moment of waking, and eventually it could come before movement rather than after it. This shift created a new pattern that now feels familiar, where the day begins with food and movement follows. Yet this pattern depends on a level of environmental control that was not present for most of human history. When we look back toward the earlier conditions, the older sequence becomes visible again, where the body begins the day by entering the world first, and only later, depending on what that world offers, arrives at food. The difference is not dramatic, but it is steady. One pattern begins with certainty and moves into action. The other begins with action and moves toward possibility. And it is within that second pattern that the human body first learned how to continue across the day without requiring that eating and waking happen at the same fixed point in time. When movement consistently comes before eating, it quietly changes how the beginning of the day is experienced, turning the morning into a period of engagement rather than immediate consumption. And this shift becomes clearer when placed against the deeper background of human life, where the body did not rely on fixed moments of intake to begin functioning. In that older setting, waking did not lead directly to eating because the conditions that would make such a sequence reliable were not yet in place. There were no prepared spaces designed around food, no stored meals waiting in a predictable location, and no shared agreement that the first act of the day should be to eat. Instead, waking led outward into the environment, and the body entered the day by responding to what was present, not by fulfilling a routine. This meant that the early hours were often shaped by movement, by scanning the landscape, by following known paths, or by adjusting to what had changed since the previous day. Eating, when it happened, was part of that process, not the starting point of it. This pattern does not need to be imagined as dramatic or extreme. It can be understood as a quieter form of continuity, where the body simply continued without immediate intake because it had done so across many generations before. The capacity to begin the day in a state of mild emptiness and to move through that state without interruption reflects an adaptation to a world where food could not be separated from effort. The human body, in its earlier conditions, was not built around the assumption that eating would occur at a fixed moment after waking. It was shaped within a sequence where activity often led to food, not the other way around. This becomes even more visible when we consider how closely early human life was tied to the environment itself. The availability of food was embedded in the landscape, not stored apart from it, and reaching that food required engagement with distance, terrain, and time. In such a setting, it would have been difficult for eating to become a stable opening event of the day. because the path toward food could not be shortened or guaranteed in advance. Some mornings may have allowed for early intake, but many would have unfolded through movement first, with eating appearing later as an outcome of that movement. Over long periods, this created a pattern that did not depend on fixed timing but on response and adjustment. As human societies gradually changed, introducing farming, storage, and more structured forms of daily life, the distance between waking and eating began to shrink. Food could be kept close, prepared in advance, and accessed without the same level of effort, allowing eating to move earlier in the sequence of the day. Eventually, this shift became common enough to feel natural, and the modern pattern of eating soon after waking took hold. Yet this pattern rests on conditions that are relatively recent when compared to the full span of human history. It depends on a controlled environment, on reliable access, and on the separation of food from the effort required to obtain it. When these conditions are set aside, the earlier pattern becomes easier to see, where the body begins with movement, not because it prefers to delay eating, but because movement is what makes eating possible in the first place. This older sequence does not disappear in modern life, but it becomes less visible, covered by routines that give the impression of permanence. Looking back toward the origin of human life, the beginning of the day appears less like a scheduled moment of intake and more like an open passage into activity, where the body steps forward before it eats, and where the order of the day is shaped by what the world offers rather than by what the clock requires, leaving the morning as a space of possibility rather than a fixed point of consumption. One of the quiet foundations behind fixed meals is something so ordinary in modern life that it almost disappears from view, which is the ability to keep food nearby after it has been found. A person can buy it, store it, return to it later, divide it into portions, and decide not only what to eat, but when to eat it. This simple control over delay is one of the hidden conditions that makes breakfast, lunch, and dinner feel stable. But across most of human history, that control was limited, uneven, or absent. Food was often tied closely to the moment in which it was found, gathered, or prepared, and once that moment passed, it could not always be held safely for later use in the calm and measured way that modern routines now assume. Without reliable storage, the day could not easily be divided into separate planned meals, because the food itself resisted that kind of planning. It might spoil, lose value, attract animals, or simply exist in forms that were difficult to preserve for long. This changes the whole structure of eating. A fixed meal pattern requires more than hunger and more than food. It requires the ability to move food across time. If something can be saved, it can be assigned to a later hour. If it cannot be saved well, then eating is drawn closer to the moment of access. In early human environments, this meant that intake often followed opportunity rather than schedule. Food might be eaten when it was available, because waiting carried risk. A gathered plant, a small animal, a shared resource, or any other edible material did not automatically become part of a planned daily sequence. It remained part of the landscape and of the moment in which it entered human hands. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life makes this even clearer. Long before storage containers, stable dwellings, controlled temperatures, and the habits of settled kitchens, humans were already living with food as something that could not always be separated from its condition in the world. It was found in changing environments, under changing weather, across changing seasons, and its usefulness was often limited by those same conditions. The body that emerged through those long periods did not live inside a world where food could be neatly protected and distributed across the day. It lived in a world where presence mattered more than timing. This does not mean early humans never saved food in any form, or never returned to something later. It means that the capacity to store safely and repeatedly at a level strong enough to support 3 fixed meals each day was not the general condition for most of human history. Even after agriculture began to spread, the path toward dependable storage remained gradual. Harvesting food is not the same as preserving it well. A society may produce grain or other foods in greater quantity and still face the difficulty of keeping those foods secure, dry, protected, and available across time. Only with improved storage practices, more settled domestic life, and stronger control over food environments could regular meals become easier to maintain. Until then, the absence of reliable storage kept daily eating patterns more open and more variable. This helps explain why fixed meals can feel so natural now, and yet still be historically young. They rest not only on the existence of food, but on the quiet human ability to hold food in reserve and decide later when it will be eaten. For most of the human story, that decision was narrower. The world pressed food closer to the moment of use. And when food cannot be easily moved across time, the clock has much less power over eating, because the day is shaped not by planned intervals, but by whatever can actually be kept, protected, and still made useful when a later hour arrives. When food cannot be reliably stored, the idea of dividing it into separate meals across the day begins to lose its foundation, because there is no stable way to carry resources forward from one moment to another without loss. In modern settings, this movement across time feels effortless. Food can be kept in controlled conditions, protected from heat, moisture, and decay, and returned to hours later in nearly the same state. This allows a person to decide not only how much to eat, but also when to eat, creating a structure where the day can be divided into clear segments, each with its own portion. But in earlier human environments, this kind of control was limited. Once food was obtained, it often existed within a narrow window of usefulness. Waiting could reduce its value, change its condition, or make it unsafe. This meant that eating was drawn toward the moment of access, not stretched across the day according to a plan. The body, living within that reality, did not experience food as something that could always be postponed and distributed evenly. It experienced food as something that appeared, existed for a time, and then passed out of reach. This creates a different rhythm, one that does not align easily with fixed hours. If food must be used while it is still viable, then the timing of eating follows the timing of availability, not the position of the sun or the divisions of the day. Some periods might involve more intake, while others might involve less, depending on what could be kept and what could not. This pattern is not defined by strict absence or abundance, but by the shifting balance between what is found and what can be preserved. Looking back toward the earlier stages of human life helps make this pattern clearer. Before advanced methods of storage became common, food was closely tied to its original form and to the environment in which it was found. A gathered plant, a hunted animal, or any other resource carried the limitations of its condition. It could not always be transformed into something that would remain stable for long. Even when people found ways to preserve certain foods, those methods varied in effectiveness and depended on climate, materials, and knowledge that developed slowly over time. This meant that the ability to extend food across the day, and especially across multiple days, was uneven and often uncertain. Because of this, the body did not live inside a system where intake could be carefully spaced. Instead, it adapted to a more fluid pattern, where eating occurred when it was most practical, not when it was most scheduled. This fluidity also affected how people related to time itself. Without reliable storage, there was less reason to divide the day into fixed eating points, because there was no guarantee that food would still be in a usable state at those points. Time remained open, shaped more by immediate conditions than by planned intervals. Even as agriculture began to increase the overall availability of food in some regions, the problem of storage did not disappear. Growing food is one step, but keeping it safe and accessible across time is another. For long periods, communities still faced limits in how well they could protect and preserve what they produced. This meant that even in more settled settings, eating patterns could remain flexible, influenced by what was available at a given moment rather than by a fixed daily schedule. Only gradually, as storage methods improved and became more reliable, did it become easier to separate the moment of obtaining food from the moment of eating it. With that separation came the possibility of planning, and with planning came the structure of meals that could be repeated at similar times each day. When seen from this longer perspective, fixed meals appear less like a natural starting point and more like the outcome of a specific condition, the ability to hold food steady across time. Without that condition, eating follows the life of the food itself, moving with its limits, its changes, and its brief periods of usefulness, rather than aligning neatly with the steady rhythm that modern life now makes possible. The deeper consequence of limited storage is that it keeps food tied to the present, and once food remains tied to the present, the idea of a fixed meal schedule becomes much harder to sustain across ordinary life. In modern settings, food can wait quietly. It can be protected from heat, dryness, moisture, insects, animals, and time itself And this quiet ability to wait is one of the hidden reasons why 3 fixed meals now feel so normal. A person can decide that something found or bought in one moment will be eaten much later, and that decision gives the clock authority over appetite. But for most of human history, that authority was weaker because food itself was less willing to wait. Its condition changed, sometimes quickly, and its usefulness could narrow before the day had fully unfolded. In that older world, food was not just something people possessed. It was something people had to keep from slipping away. This matters because a meal is not only an amount of food. It is also a successful act of delay. If food can be held safely, it can be reserved for morning, midday, or evening. If it cannot be held well, then eating moves closer to the moment of access, and the day begins to lose the neat divisions that fixed meals require. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life, this older pattern becomes easier to recognize. Long before stable homes, before enclosed kitchens, before reliable containers and controlled storage spaces, humans were already living with food that remained exposed to the limits of the natural world. Edible things were shaped by heat, cold, dampness, and time. Their value did not remain constant simply because they had been found. A useful resource could become less useful by the hour, and that meant the body often had to meet food when food was available, not when the schedule preferred. This did not make early life chaotic in every moment, but it did make eating more fluid. Some resources may have been consumed soon after they were obtained. Others may have been shared, used in parts, or preserved in modest ways depending on place and knowledge. But the broad condition across most of human history was not one of effortless delay, it was one of careful uncertainty, where keeping food for later was often difficult enough that later could not always be trusted. Even after agriculture began to reshape parts of human life, the problem remained. Growing more food did not automatically create the stable household rhythm of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Stored harvests still needed protection. Food still had to survive weather, pests, spoilage, and loss. A farming community might produce enough to reduce some uncertainty, while still lacking the strong day-to-day control needed to turn all eating into neat, repeated meals. That transformation required long developments in storage, preservation, settlement, and domestic routine. Only then could food be separated from the moment of finding it strongly enough for clock-based eating to become ordinary. Seen from this longer perspective, fixed meals appear less like an ancient human pattern and more like a late cultural achievement built on material control. They depend on the ability to hold food still while time moves forward. For most of the human story, that stillness was incomplete. Food remained vulnerable to change, and because it changed, eating had to remain flexible. The body that lived through those long ages did not emerge inside a world where food could always be saved for the next planned hour. It emerged inside a world where the present had more power than the schedule, where usefulness could fade before intention caught up, and where eating was often shaped by what could still be kept in human hands rather than by what the clock quietly asked the body to wait for. In a world where food could not be stored reliably, and where access depended on effort and chance, eating did not spread evenly across the day, but instead gathered into moments, sometimes quiet, sometimes fuller, depending on what had been found. This creates a different shape of intake from the modern pattern of 3 fixed meals. Instead of a steady rhythm, there were clusters, periods when food became available and was used, followed by stretches where nothing new appeared and the body continued without additional intake. This pattern is not built on strict absence or constant abundance, but on uneven arrival. Food came when the environment allowed it, and when it came, it often brought with it a brief window in which it could be eaten or shared. After that window, the landscape might return to a quieter state, and the body would move forward again without knowing when the next opportunity would appear. This way of eating does not fit easily into named meals. It is shaped by events rather than by hours. A successful search, a gathered patch, or a shared resource might lead to a period of eating that does not align with morning, midday, or evening in a consistent way. Some days might include several small moments of intake. Other days might involve a more noticeable event, followed by longer gaps. Over time, this creates a rhythm that is responsive rather than scheduled, where the body adjusts to what is present rather than expecting equal spacing between portions. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life makes this pattern easier to understand. Long before the systems that now support daily regularity, humans were already living within environments where food appeared in uneven ways. Plants ripened at certain times and not others. Animals moved through landscapes in patterns that could not be fully controlled. Water and weather influenced where resources could be found. Because of this, eating naturally followed these uneven patterns. The body, living within this setting, developed the ability to handle variation, to make use of what was available when it was available, and to continue when the flow of food slowed or paused. This does not mean that early humans always ate in large amounts at once, or that every opportunity led to excess. It means that the timing of eating was flexible and often grouped around moments of access. The idea of dividing food into 3 balanced meals each day would have required a level of control over both food and time that was not generally present. Instead, intake could be shaped by the size and nature of what was found. A smaller resource might be used quickly and followed by continued movement. A larger or shared resource might lead to a more extended period of eating. In both cases, the pattern remains tied to events rather than to the clock. As human societies gradually introduced more stability through farming, storage, and structured daily routines, the pattern began to change. Food could be separated from the moment of finding it and spread across the day. This allowed intake to become more evenly spaced, and over time, it supported the formation of fixed meals. But this change rests on conditions that took a long time to develop and were not present for most of human history. The older pattern, where eating followed opportunity and gathered into clusters, reflects a deeper relationship between the body and the environment. It shows a way of living where time remained open, where the day was not divided into equal parts, and where the presence of food shaped the structure of eating more than any internal schedule. When seen from this perspective, the modern pattern of evenly spaced meals appears as a later arrangement, one that smooths out the unevenness of earlier life, but does not erase the long history in which eating was tied to moments rather than to fixed hours, and where the body learned to move through those moments without requiring that they arrive in a steady and predictable sequence. When food arrives in uneven moments, the body begins to live inside a different rhythm from the one most people know today. Modern life spreads food across the day in a calm and measured way, making it possible to expect one meal after another with enough regularity that the spaces between them feel almost designed. But in older human settings, the day was not shaped by that kind of smooth repetition. It was shaped by interruption. Food appeared, was used, and then disappeared again into the uncertainty of the landscape. This meant that eating often happened in clusters, not because people were following a special plan, but because the world itself did not offer resources in a steady line. A useful patch of plants might be found and consumed within a short span of time. A successful opportunity to obtain animal food might create a stronger moment of intake, followed by a quieter stretch with little or nothing new. In both cases, the pattern remained uneven. The body was not moving through a day built around equal distances between meals. It was moving through a day that changed according to what the environment released and when it released it. This is important because it changes the meaning of hunger and eating together. In a fixed meal system, hunger is often expected to rise between planned points of intake and then settle again once the next meal arrives. In a clustered pattern, hunger and eating do not always follow that neat sequence. Food may come earlier than expected on one day and much later on another. There may be a brief period of fuller intake followed by a longer period of waiting. The body, living across many generations in such conditions, would not gain much from attaching itself too tightly to equal spacing. A looser and more adaptive rhythm makes more sense in a world where access keeps changing. Looking toward the deeper beginning of human life makes this even easier to see. Long before agriculture, before stored surplus, and before the ordinary kitchen, humans were already part of environments where resources were shaped by season, weather, movement, and chance. A landscape did not provide food in tidy portions. It offered moments. Some of those moments were small and passing. Others were more substantial. Between them, the body had to continue. This older pattern does not need to be exaggerated to be meaningful. It simply suggests that eating was often organized by the arrival of opportunity rather than by the division of the day. The day itself remained open, and food entered it in uneven ways. Even later, when agriculture began to create more reliable access in some places, the older rhythm did not disappear at once. Harvests were seasonal. Labor was uneven. Storage was still limited in many settings. This meant that intake could still gather around certain periods rather than being spread perfectly across the day. The modern feeling that meals should be evenly placed is therefore not just about food itself, but about the human ability to flatten variation, to smooth out the rough edges of the environment, and to turn uneven access into routine. For most of human history, that smoothing was incomplete. The body still lived much closer to the raw timing of the world. Food arrived in blocks, in episodes, in small windows of usefulness, and the body learned to respond to those windows without assuming that the next opportunity would appear exactly when it had the day before. Seen from this longer view, eating begins to look less like a steady line and more like a series of openings, each one shaped by the moment in which the world became briefly more generous before closing again and leaving the body to continue onward through the quiet space that followed. When food appears in clusters rather than in a smooth and repeated flow, it quietly changes not only when people eat, but what a day feels like from inside the body. In modern life, 3 meals divide time into familiar sections, and those sections help create a calm sense of order, as if the body is being carried forward by a rhythm that has always existed. Morning leads toward one meal, midday toward another, evening toward the last, and the day seems to move through a sequence that feels stable enough to be mistaken for something ancient. But in the longer human past, eating did not usually shape time in that way. Time remained more open, and food entered that openness unevenly, sometimes as a brief opportunity, sometimes as a fuller event, and sometimes not at all for longer stretches than modern routines would consider normal. The body that lived through those conditions was not organized around evenly spaced meals, but around a more uncertain pattern in which intake gathered when the world allowed it. This older rhythm becomes clearer when we return to the beginning of human life, long before agriculture, before stored abundance, and before households could separate eating from the changing state of the environment. In those early settings, a useful resource did not arrive because the hour had come. It arrived because weather, season, movement, and chance had aligned in a particular way. A plant resource might be available only briefly. A search might lead to a small amount of food that was used quickly. A more successful opportunity could create a fuller period of eating shared across a group. After that, the landscape might fall quiet again, and the body would continue through that quiet without knowing when the next opening would appear. This means that eating was often gathered around events rather than spread across a controlled schedule. The body was not being trained by equal spacing. It was being shaped by interruption, by episodes of access separated by uncertainty. That pattern matters because it suggests a different relationship between appetite and time. A body that lives inside clustered eating does not need the clock to tell it when nourishment should arrive. It needs flexibility, the ability to use what is available when it appears and to continue when the flow narrows again. This does not mean constant extremes. It means variation. Some days might contain several small eating moments. Others might turn around one more noticeable event. The important point is that the structure came from the world first, not from a fixed timetable carried inside the body. Even after agriculture began to change parts of human life, this older relationship did not vanish all at once. Fields made some resources more predictable, but harvests were still seasonal, labor still shaped access, and storage still had limits. Food could still gather around certain periods of work, preservation, or local abundance rather than settling neatly into 3 fixed meals for everyone. Only much later, as human societies gained stronger control over production, storage, transport, and daily time, could those uneven clusters be smoothed into a more regular pattern. What now feels normal depends on that smoothing. It depends on making food available in calm and repeated intervals, so that the body begins to expect order where once it had learned variation. Seen from this longer view, 3 fixed meals do not look like the original form of human eating. They look more like a later arrangement built on control. Beneath that arrangement remains a deeper human history in which food arrived in windows, in episodes, in brief periods when the environment became usable, and the body learned to receive those moments without asking that they be equal, balanced, or repeated at the same hour each day. Eating is rarely an individual act in the deeper human past, and when food is shared within a group, the timing of eating begins to depend not only on the environment, but also on the structure of the group itself. In modern life, meals are often organized around personal schedules, with each person deciding when to eat based on individual routine. even when food is shared. But in earlier human settings, the boundaries between individuals were less sharply defined in daily survival, and food was often connected to collective effort and collective access. This means that eating did not simply follow personal hunger or a fixed hour. It followed the movement, success, and condition of the group. When food was obtained, it might be distributed across several people, and that distribution could shape when and how eating occurred. A person could not always decide to eat at a particular time if food was part of a shared resource that depended on group timing rather than individual preference. This changes the rhythm of eating in a quiet but important way. Instead of 3 fixed meals repeated at the same hours for each person, intake becomes tied to moments when the group has access, and those moments are not always evenly spaced. Some periods might involve shared eating when resources are available, while other periods might pass with little or no intake, depending on what has been found and how it is divided. The body, living within this social structure, does not organize itself around individual mealtimes in the same way that modern routines allow. It adapts to a pattern where eating is influenced by relationships, cooperation, and timing that extends beyond a single person. Looking back toward the earliest phases of human life helps clarify this point. Long before agriculture, before private storage, and before clearly separated domestic spaces, humans lived in groups where access to food was often linked to shared effort. Gathering, searching, and obtaining food could involve multiple individuals, and the results of that effort were not always consumed in isolation. This does not mean that every resource was always shared equally, but it does suggest that eating was often shaped by social context rather than by fixed personal schedules. A resource might be consumed soon after it was obtained, not because of a clock, but because of the presence of others and the need to distribute what was available. This creates a pattern where eating is organized by events that involve the group rather than by hours that repeat the same way each day. The idea of breakfast, lunch, and dinner as separate, evenly spaced meals for each individual becomes difficult to maintain in such a setting, because the timing of intake depends on when the group gains access to food and how that access is managed. Even in later periods, as human societies became more settled and agriculture increased the availability of food, the influence of group structure remained. Families, communities, and social roles continued to shape when eating occurred. Meals could be tied to work, to shared activity, or to the rhythms of daily life within a group, rather than to a universal clock that applied equally to all individuals at all times. Only much later, with the development of more individualized routines, precise timekeeping, and consistent access to food for each person, did eating begin to align more closely with fixed hours that could be repeated across days without depending heavily on group variation. When viewed from this longer perspective, the modern pattern of 3 fixed meals begins to look less like a simple biological necessity and more like a structure supported by individual access and controlled environments. In earlier human conditions, eating was part of a shared experience shaped by cooperation, availability, and the movement of the group through the environment. The timing of food was not something a single person could fully determine, and because of that, the day did not easily divide into fixed personal meals. Instead, it unfolded through moments when food became available to the group, and the body learned to live within that shared and shifting rhythm, where eating was connected to others and to the environment at the same time, rather than anchored to a private schedule repeated at the same hours each day. When eating is shaped by the group rather than by the individual, the timing of food becomes less predictable and less evenly spaced, because it depends on when shared resources become available and how they are distributed among those present. In modern settings, each person can often decide when to eat, even when living with others, because food is stored in ways that allow it to be portioned, delayed, and accessed independently. This creates a pattern where meals can be repeated at similar hours across days, giving the impression that eating follows a personal rhythm that belongs to the body itself. But in earlier human environments, this independence was limited. Food was often tied to collective effort and collective access, and once obtained, it could not always be divided into neatly separated portions that each person could reserve for a specific time. Instead, eating became connected to moments when the group as a whole had something to share, and those moments did not always align with fixed points in the day. This means that the body, living within that structure, did not organize itself around private meal times. It adapted to a pattern where intake depended on the timing of the group which could change from one day to the next. A resource might be found earlier one day and later another. A shared opportunity might lead to a period of eating that does not match the usual divisions of morning, midday, or evening. Between these moments, the body continued without the certainty that another shared intake would arrive at a predictable hour. Looking back toward the earlier stages of human life helps make this pattern clearer. Long before stable storage and individual control over food became common, humans lived in groups where cooperation increased the chances of obtaining resources. Gathering, searching, and obtaining food could involve multiple people, and the results were often used within that shared context. This does not imply a single fixed system of sharing across all groups, but it does suggest that eating was frequently influenced by social conditions rather than by individual preference. The presence of others, the timing of group movement, and the nature of what was obtained all played a role in shaping when eating occurred. Because of this, the day could not be easily divided into identical personal meals for each individual. Instead, it unfolded according to the flow of shared activity and shared access. This group-based pattern also affects how we understand the spacing of intake. When food is shared, it may be consumed within a narrower window, depending on how it is distributed, rather than being stretched evenly across the day. This creates periods of collective eating followed by periods of continuation without food, and the length of these periods can vary depending on conditions. The body, living within this rhythm, learns to move through these changes without expecting equal intervals between eating events. Even after agriculture began to reshape human life and increase the availability of certain foods, the influence of group structure did not disappear. Families and communities continued to organize daily life in ways that affected when eating occurred. Meals could still be tied to shared work, shared preparation, and shared timing, rather than to a fixed personal schedule that applied equally to every individual. Only with the gradual development of more individualized access to food, combined with more precise timekeeping and stable routines, did eating begin to align more closely with fixed hours that could be repeated consistently. When viewed from this longer perspective, the modern experience of eating at the same times each day appears as a pattern supported by individual control and environmental stability. In earlier human conditions, the timing of food was shaped by the group, and because the group moved through an environment that was itself changing, eating remained flexible, shared, and uneven, rather than organized into 3 fixed personal meals that arrived at the same hours each day. When food belongs to the group before it belongs to the individual, the entire shape of eating changes in a way that makes fixed personal meals difficult to maintain. In modern life, a person can often separate private appetite from the needs of others. Food can be stored in individual portions, kept for later, and eaten according to a personal routine. This allows breakfast, lunch, and dinner to feel like private appointments between the body and the clock. But across most of human history, that kind of separation was much weaker. Food was often tied to shared labor, shared access, and shared presence, which meant that the moment of eating could not always be chosen by one person alone. It depended on when others were present, what had been obtained, how it was divided, and whether the group itself was in a position to stop and eat. This creates a slower and more collective rhythm, one in which the body does not move through the day expecting 3 private meals at fixed hours, but remains open to the changing timing of shared opportunity. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life makes this pattern easier to see. Long before private kitchens, before separate household routines, and before each person could keep their own supply of food close at hand, humans already lived in groups where survival was closely connected to cooperation. Food could come through shared movement, shared searching, and shared use of space, and when something edible became available, its timing was shaped by the group's condition rather than by a single person's hunger. A person might feel ready to eat, but if food was not yet available to the group, that feeling did not create a meal. In the same way, food might become available at a moment that did not fit any regular pattern, and the group would eat because the opportunity had arrived, not because the clock suggested it should. This does not mean that every group behaved in the same way, or that all food was always shared equally. The evidence does not support such certainty, but the broader human setting does suggest that eating was often social in timing and context, not purely individual. That alone makes fixed personal meals less likely as a deep human pattern. A meal depends not only on food, but on the power to decide when that food will be used. When that decision is shaped by the group, regularity becomes harder to preserve. The spacing between eating events can widen or narrow depending on movement, success, sharing, and the simple fact that several bodies must adjust to the same moment. This also helps explain why modern eating can feel more stable than the deeper human past. Stability grows when each person has more private control over food, more fixed domestic space, and more distance from the uncertainty of group timing. Only then can the day be divided into repeated personal meals that happen whether or not others are moving, gathering, or waiting. Yet for most of the human story, life began much closer to a collective rhythm. The body learned to live not only with environmental uncertainty, but with social timing, where eating was connected to other people and to their access, their needs, and their presence. Seen from this longer view, 3 fixed meals appear less like a timeless human design, and more like a later form of order made possible by individual access and settled routine. Beneath that order remains a much older pattern, where food moved through the group before it reached the individual, and where the body learned to accept that eating would come when shared conditions allowed it, not simply when one person, alone, had reached the hour they now call mealtime. The human body is often described today as if it prefers constant supply, as if energy must be added in steady and regular amounts for the day to remain stable. And this idea fits neatly with the modern pattern of 3 fixed meals, each one arriving before the body has to drift too far into emptiness. Yet when the body is placed back into the longer history of human life, a quieter picture begins to appear, one in which stability did not come from constant intake, but from flexibility. For most of human history, the body lived in environments where food did not arrive in evenly spaced portions, and because of that, it could not depend on a smooth and predictable flow of nourishment. It had to continue through variation, using what was available when it appeared, and then moving through periods of less intake without assuming that something else would arrive soon. This does not mean the body preferred scarcity, nor does it mean irregular eating was harmless in every circumstance. It means that the body developed within conditions where regularity could not be guaranteed, and so it remained capable of adjusting to uneven patterns, rather than requiring perfect timing to function. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life helps make this point clearer. Long before agriculture, before controlled storage, and before the household routine of breakfast, lunch, and dinner, humans were already living inside a landscape where access to food changed with season, movement, effort, and chance. In such a world, a body that could only function well when fed at exact intervals would be poorly matched to reality. A more flexible body would make more sense, one able to draw on stored energy, slow or shift its effort when needed, and continue through the changing distance between one eating event and the next. This deeper flexibility is one of the quiet foundations beneath human survival. It allowed the body to live in a world where intake could cluster, pause, and return again without following a fixed daily design. The modern meal structure can make it seem as though the body is built for steady external supply, but that impression may come partly from the smoothness of the environment, rather than from the oldest biological pattern. When food is always near, easily stored, and repeatedly available at the same hours, the body begins to live inside a calmer rhythm. Appetite can start to align with that rhythm, and regular feeding can feel like the natural condition of human life. But beneath that surface, the older body remains one that learned across far longer stretches of time to live with fluctuation. This becomes even more important when we remember that energy use itself was not identical from day to day in the past. Some days required more movement, more effort, more searching. Other days may have involved less. A body shaped in that world would benefit from being able to manage energy with some elasticity, rather than demanding identical intake in identical amounts at identical hours. Even later, when farming began to make some food sources more predictable, the body did not instantly become a machine of strict timing. Agriculture changed many things, but it did not erase the long biological history that came before it. For a very long time, human life still remained close to variation, and the body still carried its older ability to move between intake and absence without collapsing into disorder each time the pattern shifted. Seen from this longer view, the human body appears less like a system built for constant, evenly timed feeding, and more like a patient structure formed in uncertainty, capable of absorbing irregularity, because irregularity was once part of the ordinary background of being alive, long before fixed meals gave the illusion that energy had always arrived in 3 calm and dependable waves each day. If the body can move through periods of uneven intake, then its relationship with energy begins to look less like a steady line and more like a quiet adjustment that unfolds over time, shaped by what has already been stored and what may or may not arrive next. In modern life, energy often feels tied directly to recent eating, as though each meal supplies what is immediately needed to begin or continue the day, and this creates a sense that intake must be frequent and evenly spaced in order for the body to remain stable. Yet this impression becomes less certain when placed against the longer background of human life, where the body did not always have access to new food at the moment it might have preferred. Instead, it had to rely, at least for a time, on what it had already taken in. This quiet reliance on stored energy is not a special adaptation for rare situations. It is part of the ordinary function of a body that developed in environments where intake could not be guaranteed at fixed intervals. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life helps make this pattern clearer. Long before the structure of 3 daily meals, humans were already living in conditions where the gap between one eating event and the next could vary. Some days might include earlier intake, others later, and the body had to continue through these differences without requiring immediate replenishment each time hunger appeared. This does not suggest that the body ignored hunger or that food was unimportant. It suggests that the body could manage time in a flexible way, using what had been stored to bridge the distance between opportunities. This bridging is one of the quiet processes that makes irregular eating possible. When food is consumed, it does not only serve the moment, it contributes to a reserve that can be drawn upon later, allowing the body to continue even when new intake is delayed. In early human settings where food followed the changing conditions of the environment, this ability would have been essential. The body could not assume that the next opportunity would arrive soon, so it remained capable of continuing without precise timing. This creates a different understanding of daily rhythm. Instead of a sequence of evenly spaced inputs, the day becomes a flow in which energy is used, conserved, and drawn from prior intake as needed. Some periods may involve more intake, others less, and the body adjusts across that variation without requiring the pattern to be perfectly balanced at every point. This adjustment is not extreme or dramatic. It is gradual, quiet, and shaped over long stretches of time. Even as human societies became more stable, especially with the development of agriculture and later with more controlled food systems, this deeper pattern did not disappear. The body still carried its older capacity for flexibility, even as daily life began to favor more regular intake. Over time, repeated schedules could shape perception, making it feel as though energy must always be refreshed at the same hours. But this feeling may reflect the structure of the environment more than the original structure of the body. When the environment offers food in calm and repeated intervals, the body aligns with that pattern. When it does not, the body remains capable of adjusting, at least within certain limits, because that is how it learned to function over most of human history. Seen from this longer view, the modern expectation of evenly timed meals appears as a surface layer built on top of a deeper capacity to move through time without perfect regularity, where energy is not only something that arrives with each meal, but something that can be carried forward, allowing the body to continue through the day even when intake does not follow the steady rhythm that now feels so familiar. When the body is viewed across the full length of human history, one of its quiet strengths is not constant fullness, but the ability to remain stable while conditions change, and this matters because it shifts the meaning of fixed meals. In modern life, regular eating can make energy seem simple, as if the body works best only when food arrives in steady portions at steady hours, each meal replacing what the last few hours have used. But the deeper human story suggests something more patient. For most of human history, the body did not live inside that smooth arrangement. It lived in a world where food could be delayed, uneven, or clustered, and where activity could not always wait for perfect replenishment. In that setting, the body did not survive by demanding exact timing. It survived by adjusting. This adjustment is one of the oldest parts of the human story, reaching back toward the early environments in which people lived before agriculture, before kitchens, and before the daily expectation that food should appear in 3 calm and predictable waves. In those earlier conditions, energy could not depend entirely on what had just been eaten, because what had just been eaten might be very little, or it might have happened much earlier, or it might not yet have happened at all. The body therefore had to carry time differently. It had to continue through the changing distance between one opportunity and the next, drawing not only on the immediate present, but on what had already been stored within it. This does not mean irregular eating was ideal in every case, and it does not mean the body welcomed uncertainty. It means uncertainty was normal enough that the body remained capable of living inside it. That capability matters because it suggests that the human body was shaped less by fixed timing than by flexible continuity. It could move, think, and endure while intake remained unsettled. The day did not have to be perfectly divided for the body to continue being human. This becomes even clearer when we think about how variable early life could be from one day to the next. Weather changed effort. Landscape changed access. A more successful day might bring more food, while another might bring less, and the body had to cross between those days without being rebuilt each morning from the beginning. It carried reserves forward. It slowed or adjusted when needed. It used what had already entered the system and made that earlier intake last into the uncertain present. This is a very different image from the modern idea that each meal stands alone as a separate requirement. In the older pattern, one eating event could continue to matter long after it ended, because the body was never relying only on the immediate moment. Even later, when agriculture began to make some forms of eating more regular, the body did not suddenly lose this older flexibility. Farming changed landscapes and schedules, but it did not erase the long biological past that came before it. For a very long time, human life still remained close to variation, and the body still carried the quiet ability to pass through uneven intake without treating every delay as a crisis. Seen from this longer view, fixed meals begin to look less like the original structure of human energy and more like a later cultural arrangement placed onto a much older biological foundation. Beneath the calm repetition of breakfast, lunch, and dinner remains a body shaped in uncertainty, one that learned over countless generations to remain present, active, and alive even when food did not arrive in equal amounts at equal hours, and even when the space between one meal and the next remained open, shifting, and unresolved. For a long time, the structure of human eating followed the movement of the environment, the limits of storage, and the rhythm of shared life. But something began to change when people started to remain in one place and shape the land around them. This change did not happen all at once, and it did not create modern eating patterns immediately, but it marked a slow turning point in the relationship between humans, food, and time. When early forms of agriculture began to appear in different parts of the world, they introduced a new possibility, which was not certainty in the modern sense, but a growing degree of predictability. Instead of relying entirely on what could be found in the landscape at a given moment, people began to influence when certain foods would become available by planting, tending, and returning to the same locations over extended periods. This did not eliminate variation, but it began to narrow it. A planted area could be expected to produce something in the future, even if the exact outcome was not guaranteed. This shift matters because it slowly altered how food could relate to time. When people knew that food would emerge from the same place again, they could begin to organize their days differently, even if only in small ways at first. Yet it is important not to imagine this moment as the sudden birth of fixed meals. Early agriculture did not create breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the form now familiar. The conditions required for that level of daily regularity were still incomplete. Crops depended on weather, soil, water, and care, and the outcome could vary from one season to the next. Storage methods were still developing, and the ability to keep food stable across long periods remained uneven. This meant that even as people began to settle, eating patterns continued to reflect both the new stability of cultivation and the older uncertainty that had not yet disappeared. Looking back toward the deeper origin of human life helps place this change in context. For most of human history before agriculture, food followed the environment, and the body adapted to that movement. With the introduction of farming, humans began to shape the environment in return, creating spaces where food could be expected to appear again. This did not erase the earlier pattern, but it added a new layer to it. The body was now living inside a mixed condition, part old flexibility, part emerging stability. Some days could be more predictable, especially in relation to work and the tending of crops, while other aspects of life still depended on variation and uncertainty. This mixed condition also affected how eating could be organized. Work in the fields, preparation of food, and the rhythms of daily labor began to influence when people might eat. But these influences were not yet uniform across all communities or consistent across all days. The idea of dividing the day into 3 evenly spaced meals required more than the presence of agriculture. It required reliable storage, regular labor schedules, shared social norms, and a level of control over food that could support repetition without interruption. These elements developed slowly, often unevenly across regions and cultures, and for long periods, eating remained flexible even within farming societies. Some meals might become more common at certain times of day, but the strict pattern that now feels ordinary was still forming. Seen from this longer perspective, agriculture appears not as the beginning of fixed meals, but as a gradual shift toward the conditions that would eventually make them possible. It brought humans closer to regularity, but did not fully deliver it. The body, still carrying its older ability to adapt, continued to live across variation, even as the environment became slightly more predictable. This moment in history does not replace what came before. It sits on top of it, slowly changing the relationship between food and time, but leaving the deeper pattern of flexibility still present beneath the surface, waiting quietly inside a body that had learned, over far longer stretches of time, to continue without needing every day to look exactly the same. As agriculture spread and people began to rely more on cultivated land, food became easier to anticipate in a broad seasonal sense, but daily life still remained far less regular than modern eating habits might suggest. A field could promise future grain, a tended space could offer returning harvests, and a settlement could hold food closer to where people lived. Yet none of this meant that the day itself had already been divided into breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Farming changed the source of food before it fully changed the timing of food. This is an important difference, because it shows that predictability in production is not the same as predictability in daily eating. Crops still depended on weather, labor, pests, soil, and storage, and each of these could interrupt the smooth rhythm that fixed meals require. Even when food existed in greater quantity than before, it still had to be processed, protected, and carried through time, and that work was uneven. The body, which had already been shaped for a very long time in conditions of variation, did not suddenly enter a world of perfect regularity simply because humans had begun to plant. Looking back toward the older human beginning helps keep this shift in proportion. For most of the human story, food came from a moving landscape, and the body adapted to that openness. Agriculture narrowed some of that uncertainty by placing food into known locations, but it did not erase uncertainty itself. A planted field might succeed or fail. A harvest might be strong or weak. Stored food might last well or poorly. This meant that early farming communities often lived in a mixed world, one that was more stable than the older foraging world in some ways, but still far from the modern system that supports 3 fixed meals each day. Daily eating patterns were therefore likely shaped by a combination of available crops, work demands, household structure, and local custom, rather than by a universal timetable. Food could be more present than before, and still not be evenly spaced. A person might eat according to labor needs, preparation time, or what was currently usable, not because the clock had reached a named hour. This gradual nature of change matters, because modern people often imagine agriculture as the clear dividing line between irregular and regular eating. But the historical picture is quieter than that. Farming did not instantly turn food into a stable daily schedule. It created the possibility of greater repetition, but the full organization of meals required other developments as well. Settled domestic space had to become more established. Storage had to improve. Food preparation had to fit into repeated routines. Communities had to begin sharing stronger assumptions about when eating should happen. These are cultural and material changes layered onto agriculture, not automatic results of agriculture alone. Even within farming life, there could still be long traces of older flexibility, where food followed the day's demands rather than dividing the day in advance. Seen from this longer view, agriculture appears as a bridge rather than a conclusion. It moved human life closer to regular eating without fully creating it. It gave food a more reliable place in the landscape, but not yet a perfectly reliable place in the hour-by-hour structure of the day. The body continued to live in that in-between condition, carrying its older adaptability into a new world that was becoming more settled but was not yet fully controlled. This is why the rise of farming should be understood not as the beginning of 3 fixed meals, but as one long step toward the possibility of them. A slow rearrangement of time, labor, and food that would take many generations before it could begin to feel natural enough to be mistaken for something that had always been there. Agriculture did not erase the older human relationship with food. It slowly rearranged it. This may be the clearest way to understand its role. Before farming, the timing of eating was shaped mostly by movement, season, luck, shared effort, and the limits of storage. After farming began, some of those forces remained, but another force entered the picture. Return. People could come back to the same land, expect certain plants to grow there, and begin to build life around places that promised food in the future. That promise was new and important, but it was still only a promise. It did not yet mean that food had become steady enough to divide every day into 3 fixed meals. The land could fail, weather could interrupt, stored crops could be damaged, work could absorb the day before food was prepared. In this way, agriculture brought greater regularity to the broad cycle of life, without immediately bringing strict regularity to each individual day. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life makes this transition easier to see. For a very long time, the human body had already been living inside a world where food appeared unevenly and where hunger did not belong to the clock. That older body did not disappear when fields appeared. It continued into the farming world, carrying with it the same flexibility that had been built over countless generations. This meant that early farming life did not begin from a blank starting point. It began from a body and a habit of life already shaped by variation. Farming changed the surroundings, but the older rhythms still remained underneath. People may have had more reasons to expect food from certain places, yet daily eating could still shift with labor, season, household conditions, and how well food could be protected once harvested. A field could make the future more visible, but it could not make every day identical. This is why the farming transition should be understood as gradual in its effect on meals. It made regular eating more possible, but not automatic. The clock still had limited authority. The day was still shaped by the work of tending land, preparing food, and responding to practical needs. In some settings, food may have become more tied to repeated daily habits, but the broader human pattern was still moving through a long middle stage, no longer fully dependent on wild opportunity, but not yet living inside the firm structure of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This middle stage may have lasted for a very long time in different forms across different regions. Human history does not move everywhere at once, and neither do eating habits. Some communities could become more settled while still keeping flexible food rhythms. Others might build stronger routines, but not the exact routines familiar today. What matters is the direction of change. Agriculture began to reduce some uncertainty and gave food a more lasting place in human time, but it did not finish the process. The complete separation between finding food and eating food still required later developments in storage, domestic routine, social timing, and eventually more precise control over the day itself. Seen from this longer perspective, agriculture looks less like the moment fixed meals were born and more like the moment the ground began to shift beneath them. It prepared the world for regular meals without fully creating them. It placed humans in closer relationship with repeated food sources, but left enough uncertainty in daily life that flexibility still mattered. The body continued to live in that in-between world, part old adaptation, part new order, and that may be one of the quiet truths behind this history. What now feels like a simple and natural daily habit did not appear the moment humans planted fields. It emerged slowly from a long rearrangement of land, labor, time, and expectation. Farming changed the human story, but for a long while it changed it only part of the way, leaving people still close enough to variation that eating remained something shaped by circumstance, not yet something fully ruled by the hour. The idea that eating should happen at fixed times became much stronger only when time itself began to change in human life. For most of history, people lived by light, weather, season, labor, and the changing conditions of the world around them. A day was felt, not divided with precision. Morning came when the sky changed. Work began when conditions allowed. Food appeared when it could be found, prepared, or shared. In that kind of life, Eating could repeat in familiar ways, but it was still difficult for meals to become strict appointments with the hour. Something deeper had to happen first. Human beings had to begin measuring the day more carefully, and then they had to begin trusting that measurement enough to organize ordinary life around it. This was a slow transformation, but once it began, it changed more than work and rest. It also changed food. When time becomes more exact, eating can begin to move with it. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life makes this shift easier to understand. The body was formed long before clocks shaped daily routine. For a very long time, human beings were already waking, walking, searching, sharing, and eating in environments where the day had loose edges. Light mattered, but light is not the same as a timetable. A person could feel the progress of the day without dividing it into precise units. In that world, hunger did not need to wait for noon, and eating did not need to wait for evening. Both were connected more closely to what the environment allowed than to a fixed system of measured time. Even when agriculture made food more predictable in some places, that did not immediately create clock-based meals, because food can become more stable before time becomes more strict. Fields may return each season, but daily life can still remain flexible if the day itself is not sharply divided. This is why the growth of timekeeping matters so much in the history of meals. Once people began to structure labor, religion, trade, and public life around repeated points in the day, eating slowly began to settle into those same points. A meal no longer had to follow only hunger, access, or the flow of shared opportunity. It could begin to follow the schedule. This did not happen everywhere in the same way, and it did not happen all at once. But the direction is important. The more human life became tied to repeated hours, the easier it became for food to do the same. A person could work until a known pause, eat when that pause arrived, and then continue. Over time, this repeated pattern could begin to feel natural, even though it depended on a level of social organization that had not existed across most of the human past. The body, which had once lived in a much looser relationship with time, now began living inside a world that asked for greater regularity. Meals started to become markers within the day, not just responses to circumstance. This change also made eating more collective in a new way. In earlier life, shared eating often followed shared access to food. In more structured societies, shared eating could follow shared hours. People no longer needed the environment to bring them together in the same way. The schedule could do that. Seen from this longer view, fixed meals begin to look less like a direct expression of ancient biology and more like a product of measured time entering ordinary life. The body did not originally emerge in a world ruled by exact hours. It emerged in a world of shifting light, unstable food, and open days. Only later did human beings begin to divide time sharply enough for eating to become something that could be expected not just today, but at nearly the same hour tomorrow, and then again the day after that, until the rhythm of the clock slowly began to feel older than it really was. As measured time became more important in human life, it did not simply add structure to the day. It slowly changed what people expected from the day, and food was drawn into that change. Once hours began to matter more for work, worship, trade, and social order, eating could begin to detach itself from pure circumstance and attach itself to repeated moments. This is a very different condition from the older human world. In that older world, the body moved through light, weather, labor, and opportunity, without needing the day to be broken into exact units. Hunger could rise when it rose. Food could appear when it appeared. A person might eat earlier one day and later the next without feeling that something had gone wrong. But when time becomes sharper, variation begins to feel less normal. A missed hour becomes noticeable. A delayed pause becomes disruptive. The day starts to behave like a sequence, and meals can begin to settle into that sequence. Looking back toward the deeper beginning of human life helps show how unusual this change really was. For most of human history, the body had already been living for a very long time, without clocks directing ordinary intake. Humans woke with daylight, rested with darkness, and moved through landscapes where food could not be summoned simply because a certain point in the day had arrived. Even after agriculture made some food sources more predictable, daily eating still remained partly open because time itself was not yet strict enough to govern everything. The turning point came not only from food becoming more available, but from the day becoming more measurable. Once societies began organizing activity around clearer repeated hours, meals could become pauses built into social order. A person no longer had to eat only when food was found or when the group happened to stop. A person could eat when the schedule allowed. This is one of the quiet changes that makes fixed meals possible. The clock does not produce food, but it creates shared permission to stop, prepare, and eat at certain moments again and again. Over time, this repetition can become so familiar that it starts to feel biological, even though it depends on systems outside the body. This shift also changes the meaning of hunger. In an older setting, hunger belongs mostly to the body and the environment. In a more structured setting, hunger begins to live partly in expectation. A person may start feeling ready for food not only because of energy use, but because the same hour has brought food many times before. Appetite begins to learn the schedule. The body is still real, still responding to need, but that response is now shaped by routine in a stronger way. This does not mean that measured time completely replaced older flexibility. The body still carried its long history of adaptation, and daily life was never identical everywhere, but the balance was shifting. Time was becoming strong enough to guide eating in ways it could not for most of the human past. This mattered especially in communities where many people had to coordinate their labor and their rest. Shared hours made food easier to organize. A meal could become part of order itself, placed between blocks of work, attached to social custom, and repeated often enough to become normal. Seen from this longer perspective, fixed meals begin to look less like ancient human instinct and more like the result of a new relationship between food and the measured day. The body came from a world of open time, but human societies slowly built a world of marked time, and once that happened, eating could begin to follow not just the uncertainty of life, but the quiet authority of the hour. When time becomes something a society can measure, repeat, and expect, food begins to change its place in the day in a way that would have been difficult across most of earlier human life. This may be the quiet turning point behind fixed meals. For a very long time, human beings had already been eating, moving, resting, and surviving without precise daily hours guiding those actions. The body came from a world where light mattered more than numbers, where weather could shift the whole shape of a day, and where food arrived according to season, labor, distance, and chance. In that older setting, the day had a flow, but not a strict frame. A person could feel morning, feel the middle of the day, feel evening, yet still live without expecting food to appear at the same exact point each time. Hunger remained connected to effort and availability more than to a repeated schedule. Even when agriculture began to make some food sources more dependable, the body was still living in a world where daily timing remained partly open. What changed later was not only access to food, but the increasing power of the measured day itself. Once hours became reliable markers in human life, they began to pull ordinary behavior into alignment. Work could start at known times, pauses could be expected, duties could be organized, and eating could settle into the same pattern. A meal no longer needed to be only a response to the uncertain appearance of food. It could become part of a timetable. This shift may seem simple, but it changed the rhythm of life deeply. The clock gave food a place to return to. A person could stop because the hour had arrived, not only because hunger had become strong or because an opportunity had suddenly appeared. Over time, this repeated return gave meals a new kind of stability, one built not entirely on the body and not entirely on the landscape, but on shared social time. Looking back toward the beginning of human life makes this seem especially new. The first humans did not emerge in a world where noon existed as a fixed social pause or where evening meals could be expected because the day had been divided in advance. They emerged in a world of open conditions, where the body had to remain flexible because time itself was flexible. That older body did not disappear when societies became more structured. It remained, but it began living inside a different frame. Repeated hours taught appetite to anticipate. Regular pauses made eating more predictable. Social order strengthened the expectation that food should appear at certain moments, and once that expectation became common enough, it started to feel natural. Yet the naturalness came late. It was built gradually from timekeeping, shared routine, and repeated coordination across many lives. This is why fixed meals can feel ancient, while still being historically recent. They borrow some of their strength from the body, but much of their stability comes from a world that humans slowly built around the body. Seen from this longer view, the clock did not invent hunger, but it reshaped when hunger was noticed, when food was prepared, and when people believed eating should happen. The deeper human story remains one of flexibility, but layered over that flexibility is a newer order, where the day is measured closely enough that meals can return again and again at familiar hours until the rhythm of social time becomes so quiet and constant that it begins to seem like it had always belonged to human life, even though for most of that life it did not. The structure of fixed meals became even stronger when daily life was pulled into systems that demanded regularity not just from the body, but from entire populations. Before that, human eating had already been moving slowly toward greater predictability through farming, storage, and measured time. But the rise of more tightly organized work gave fixed meals a new force. When large numbers of people began living within schedules shaped by workshops, factories, schools, offices, and other repeated forms of labor, the day itself became less open. Time was no longer only measured, it was assigned. A person was expected to begin at a certain hour, continue through a certain block of effort, pause at a certain point, and stop again later. Once life takes this form, food is drawn into the same pattern. Meals become not only moments of nourishment, but scheduled breaks inside a larger machine of daily order. This matters because it helps explain why 3 fixed meals now feel so normal. They are supported not just by appetite, but by systems built to organize human time with great consistency. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life makes this shift appear even more striking. For most of human history, people did not live inside a world where millions of lives moved through the same time structure each day. The body was formed in much looser conditions, where hunger, movement, rest, and access to food remained tied to light, labor, environment, and local custom rather than to a broad social timetable repeated with precision. Even in early farming societies, time could still remain more flexible than it would later become. But when work became more standardized, food also had to become more standardized. A labor system functions more smoothly when people eat at predictable times, when breaks can be coordinated, and when the day is divided into clear segments shared by many people at once. The meal, in that world, becomes part of discipline. Breakfast prepares the body for work. Midday eating becomes a pause allowed by the schedule. Evening food marks the end of labor and the return to domestic life. Over time, these repeated points in the day become so familiar that they begin to feel less like social arrangements and more like simple human facts. Yet they depend on conditions that are historically recent. They depend on strong coordination, shared timetables, and reliable access to food within a structured daily routine. This does not mean that everyone everywhere followed the same exact pattern, or that older forms of flexibility vanished completely. Human life always remains more varied than a single model suggests, but the broad direction is clear. The more society organized work into repeated hours, the more meals were pulled into those hours as stable companions. This also changed the way people understood hunger. Instead of being shaped mainly by environment and bodily need, hunger began to be interpreted through the schedule. A person might eat because it was the designated break, even if the body did not arrive at that moment through the same kind of uncertainty that shaped earlier human life. Appetite, expectation, and social order started working together. Seen from this longer view, the modern 3-meal pattern appears not as an ancient inheritance carried intact from the beginning, but as a later arrangement reinforced by structured labor and repeated daily timing. Beneath it remains the much older human body, one shaped in environments where the day stayed open and food did not arrive as part of a managed routine. The modern schedule gave meals a firmness they had not possessed across most of the human past, and once that firmness settled into ordinary life, it became easy to mistake a social system for a biological destiny. As daily life became more tightly organized, the meal stopped being only a response to hunger or opportunity and became part of the structure that held the day together. This is one of the quiet reasons fixed meals grew stronger in more recent human history. In earlier worlds, a person might eat when food became available, when work allowed, or when the group paused naturally. But in a more scheduled society, natural pauses become less important than assigned pauses. The day is no longer open enough to let eating drift according to changing conditions. Instead, work begins to decide when eating can happen. A factory, a school, an office, or any other rigid form of shared labor does not easily bend around individual appetite. It asks the body to fit itself into a wider pattern, and meals become part of that pattern because they must. Breakfast begins to matter because the day now starts on time. Midday food becomes more fixed because many people are stopping together under the same external rule. Evening food becomes more predictable because labor has a clearer endpoint. Over time, this repeated arrangement becomes so familiar that it starts to feel like common sense, even though it depends on a world built from schedules, institutions, and controlled routines rather than from the older conditions in which the human body first took shape. Looking back toward the beginning of human life makes this difference easier to feel. For most of human history, people were not waking into a society where bells, shifts, and timetables quietly organized millions of bodies in parallel. They were living much closer to daylight, weather, movement, and local demands. Even when communities became more settled through agriculture, the day could still remain flexible in important ways. Work was real, but it was not always divided into the same repeated blocks with the same enforced pauses. Once that later system arrived, food had to become more regular because the body had less freedom to respond to hunger in its older way. A worker could not simply stop whenever the body asked. A child in a structured school day could not eat whenever appetite rose. The schedule became stronger than spontaneous need, and because of that, meals became tied less to the direct flow of the body and more to the social frame surrounding the body. This did not erase hunger, but it changed how hunger was interpreted. A person could begin to expect food because the break was coming, or eat because the break had arrived, even if appetite itself was being shaped by routine rather than by the more variable patterns that marked earlier human life. This is one of the deepest changes in the history of meals. Food became synchronized not only with time, but with collective discipline. Entire populations could now eat according to similar rhythms because they were living inside similar daily constraints. That made meals more visible, more repeatable, and more powerful as social norms. A person raised inside that order could easily assume that 3 meals were simply the natural human pattern, because the pattern would appear everywhere at once, in homes, workplaces, schools, and public life. Yet this apparent naturalness rests on a very recent level of coordination. For most of the human story, the body did not live inside such a tightly managed day. It lived inside environments where flexibility still mattered, where the timing of food remained more open, and where life was not yet smooth enough to place breakfast, lunch, and dinner into firm social slots for nearly everyone. Seen from this longer view, the modern meal schedule becomes easier to recognize as part of a disciplined world, one that did not create hunger, but taught hunger to live within the repeated architecture of work, pause, and return, until eating at fixed hours began to feel less like an arrangement, and more like the obvious shape of human life itself. When meals become part of a disciplined social day, their regularity begins to feel far older than it truly is. This may be the final effect of all the changes that came before. Agriculture made food more predictable in some places, storage made food easier to carry across time, timekeeping gave the day sharper edges, structured labor turned those edges into obligations. By the time these layers came together, eating no longer needed to wait for the environment, for shared chance, or even for the body's older flexibility to reveal itself. It could now follow a schedule strong enough to shape entire populations. Breakfast, midday eating, and evening food became part of the ordinary design of life, repeated so often that they seemed less like a human invention and more like something the body had always wanted. Yet when we look back toward the beginning of human life, this impression becomes difficult to hold. The earliest humans did not wake into a measured day designed by institutions. They did not live inside systems that coordinated work, pauses, and food across large settled populations. They lived in conditions where the body had to remain open to uncertainty, where access to food changed with movement, season, labor, sharing, and luck. That older body did not vanish when modern routines appeared. It remained inside the newer system, but the system grew powerful enough to hide the body's older history beneath repeated habit. This is why fixed meals can feel so natural now. They are reinforced everywhere. A person sees them in childhood, at home, in school, in work life, in public life, in social custom. The day itself seems built around them. Once that happens, the pattern no longer appears cultural. It appears obvious. But obvious things are not always ancient things. Sometimes they are simply repeated things. Sometimes a habit becomes so steady that it starts to imitate biology. This matters because the modern meal pattern did not arise from a single moment and did not descend unchanged from the earliest human past. It emerged slowly from a long convergence of settled food, measurable time, and organized labor. Only when these forces became strong enough together could eating settle into firm daily positions and remain there across generations. Even then, the deeper body beneath the routine still carried its long experience of variation. That older history is not erased by a clock. It is only covered by one. Seen from this longer view, 3 fixed meals begin to look less like the original human design and more like the final layer of a very recent order, one that depends on unusual stability and strong coordination. For most of the human story, life did not provide either of those things consistently. The day remained open, food remained uneven, and the body remained capable of continuing across that unevenness. The modern schedule changed the appearance of eating by making regularity common, but it did not rewrite the full depth of the past. Beneath breakfast, lunch, and dinner remains a much older human rhythm, quieter and less precise, formed in a world where meals were not fixed points in time, but changing responses to whatever the day, the group, and the land were willing to give. In modern life, the pattern of 3 fixed meals can feel so stable that it begins to disappear into the background, becoming part of the quiet structure of the day rather than something that invites attention. A person wakes, eats, continues, pauses, eats again, and later finishes the day with a final meal. And this sequence repeats often enough that it starts to feel like a natural rhythm the body depends on. Yet when this pattern is placed beside the much longer history of human life, it begins to reveal a subtle tension, not a failure, not a clear mismatch, but a difference between how the body was shaped and how the day is now arranged. For most of human history, the body did not live inside a system where food arrived at fixed and evenly spaced moments. It lived in a world where intake could vary, where the distance between one eating event and the next could change, and where the day remained open enough for that variation to exist without being corrected. The modern pattern does not erase this older history, but it does place the body into a more controlled frame, one that asks for repetition where there was once more flexibility. Looking back toward the beginning of human life makes this contrast easier to see. The body emerged in environments where food followed landscape, season, effort, and chance, not the clock. Hunger could rise without immediate resolution. Eating could occur at different times across different days. The rhythm of intake was shaped by what was possible, not by what was planned. Over many generations, the body learned to live inside that openness, developing the ability to move, think, and continue even when intake was not perfectly timed. This does not mean the body preferred uncertainty, but it does mean uncertainty was part of its formation. When the modern system of fixed meals became common, it introduced a new layer of order. Food could be accessed easily, stored safely, and distributed across the day in a calm and repeated way. The body, living within this system, began to align with it. Appetite could begin to follow the schedule. Hunger could start to appear near expected meal times. The day could feel smoother, more predictable, and easier to manage. Yet beneath this surface, the older capacity for flexibility remains present. The body does not become entirely dependent on fixed meals simply because they are repeated. It continues to carry the ability to adjust, to continue when timing shifts, and to operate across variation when needed. This creates a quiet tension, not a conflict, but a layering. On one level, the body lives inside a structured day, shaped by repeated meals and controlled time. On another level, it remains a product of a much longer past, where such structure was not guaranteed. This tension is not something most people notice in everyday life, because modern conditions are stable enough to keep the pattern consistent. But it becomes visible when the pattern changes. A delayed meal, a missed meal, or a shift in routine can reveal that the body does not immediately stop functioning when the schedule is interrupted. It continues, drawing on older capacities that were formed long before fixed meals became common. This does not mean that modern eating patterns are wrong or that earlier patterns were better. It means that the current system rests on a body that was not originally shaped for perfect regularity. Even in later historical periods, after agriculture and structured time had become more common, human life still carried traces of variation. Different regions, cultures, and conditions produced different eating patterns, some more regular, some less. The three-meal structure that now feels so familiar is not universal across all times and places. It is one arrangement among many, supported by specific conditions that allow it to remain stable. Seen from this longer view, the modern day appears as a carefully organized surface, laid over a deeper, more flexible foundation. The body moves through that surface smoothly, often without noticing the difference, but the difference remains. It is the quiet gap between a system built for repetition and a history shaped by variation. And within that gap, the question of fixed meals becomes less about what is normal and more about how recent normal can sometimes feel older than it truly is, simply because it is repeated often enough to become invisible. When this quiet difference between the older body and the modern schedule is allowed to unfold slowly, it begins to show itself not as a conflict, but as a layering of two different kinds of time living together inside the same day. On the surface, there is the measured day, divided into clear segments marked by repeated meals that return at familiar hours. Beneath that surface, there is a deeper sense of time carried by the body itself, one that does not depend entirely on fixed points, but moves more gradually, shaped by energy use, prior intake, and the simple passage of activity. In modern life, these two layers often align well enough that the difference is difficult to notice. Meals arrive on time, hunger seems to follow, and the day feels orderly. But when something shifts, when a meal is delayed, when a schedule changes, or when the pattern is interrupted, the older layer can become visible again, revealing that the body is not entirely bound to the clock in the way the daily routine might suggest. This does not mean the body ignores structure. It means the body can hold more than one structure at once. Looking back toward the earlier beginning of human life helps make this layering easier to understand. The body was formed across long periods in environments where time was not divided into precise units, where eating followed opportunity rather than schedule, and where the day remained open enough for variation to be part of normal experience. In that setting, energy was managed across changing intervals, not fixed ones. Hunger could rise and soften without being tied to a repeated hour. Activity could continue while waiting for food, and the distance between eating events could shift from one day to the next. This created a form of internal timing that was less rigid, less dependent on external markers, and more connected to the body's own ongoing state. When modern systems introduced fixed meals, they did not replace this older timing completely. They added a second layer. The body began to respond to repeated hours, to anticipate food at certain points, and to align appetite with daily routine, but it still retained its deeper ability to adjust when those routines changed. This is why a missed meal does not immediately stop the body from continuing, and why the sense of hunger can sometimes fade or return in ways that do not perfectly match the clock. The body is still carrying its longer history, even while living inside a more controlled environment. This layered experience can be seen as a form of quiet coexistence rather than a problem. The modern schedule provides stability, making daily life easier to organize and coordinate. The older flexibility provides resilience, allowing the body to continue when that stability shifts. Together, they create a system that is both structured and adaptable, even if that dual nature is rarely noticed in ordinary life. It only becomes visible when the pattern is disturbed, when eating does not happen at the expected time, and the body reveals that it is not entirely dependent on that expectation. Even across more recent history, human eating patterns have never been completely uniform. Different cultures, climates, and ways of life have produced variations in how food is spaced across the day. The three-meal structure is common in many modern settings, but it is not the only possible arrangement, and its stability depends on the same conditions that support it: regular time, reliable access, and shared routine. Seen from this longer perspective, the modern pattern of fixed meals can be understood as one layer resting on top of another, a visible order shaped by recent human systems, placed over a quieter, older rhythm that continues to move beneath it. steady enough to remain unnoticed, but present enough to remind us that the body's history is longer than the schedule it now follows. What makes this difference so quiet is that modern life is good at making recent patterns feel ancient. When something repeats every day across childhood, family life, work, school, and old age, it stops looking like a system and starts looking like nature. 3 meals can feel like that. They can seem so stable, so ordinary, and so deeply woven into the shape of the day that it becomes difficult to imagine human life without them. Yet the longer human story continues to suggest something more flexible beneath this familiar order. For most of human history, the body did not live inside a world where food arrived in 3 calm and evenly spaced waves. It lived in a world where the timing of intake shifted with the land, with the group, with labor, with season, and with chance. This older body did not disappear when modern routines became common. It remained, carrying forward a long ability to tolerate variation even while learning to live within a more regular daily frame. That is why the modern pattern can feel both natural and slightly imposed at the same time, even if most people never pause long enough to notice it. The body can settle into fixed meals because repetition is powerful, but the body also carries an older memory of uncertainty, not as thought, not as culture, but as form, as a way of continuing through time without requiring perfect regularity. Looking back toward the beginning of human life makes this easier to understand. Early humans did not begin the day inside kitchens, storage rooms, and clock-based schedules. They began inside open conditions, where food was not guaranteed and where the distance between one eating event and the next could not be fully controlled. In those conditions, the body had to remain patient. Hunger could not always be answered immediately. Activity could not always wait for food. Some days would contain more access, others less, and the body had to continue across both. Over many generations, this created a form of resilience that was not dramatic, but steady. The body did not require the day to be perfectly divided in order to remain alive and functional. Later, as agriculture, storage, timekeeping, and organized labor slowly reshaped human life, a different layer settled over that older foundation. Food became easier to predict. Time became easier to measure. Meals became easier to place at repeated hours. The day grew smoother, and the body, living inside that smoother day, adapted to its rhythm. But adaptation does not erase origin. The body can learn a schedule without having been originally built by that schedule. This may be the most important quiet point in the entire question. Fixed meals are real, familiar, and often useful within the world people now live in, but their familiarity should not be mistaken for deep age. They are a later arrangement resting on a much older biological history. Even now, that older history reveals itself in small ways. The body can continue through delay. Hunger can shift, soften, return, or pass through the background. Energy does not vanish the moment a meal is late. These are not signs that the modern pattern is false. They are reminders that the body is deeper than the routine. Seen from this longer view, the tension between fixed meals and human history becomes less like a contradiction and more like a layering of time. On the surface is the recent world, orderly, measured, and repeated. Beneath it is the deeper human world, less precise, less protected, and more open to variation. The modern meal schedule belongs mostly to the surface. The body belongs to both, and perhaps that is why fixed meals can feel so normal, while still not being the full story of how humans first learned to live through a day without knowing exactly when food would come next. At the end of this long path, the question of fixed meals becomes less about right or wrong, and more about understanding how something so familiar came to feel so permanent. 3 meals a day can seem like a quiet truth about the human body, something stable enough to be taken for granted, something that appears in childhood and follows people through most of their lives without needing explanation. Yet when this pattern is placed against the wider background of human history, it begins to look less like a deep biological rule and more like a carefully built arrangement, one that rests on layers of change that accumulated slowly over time. The body did not begin inside this arrangement. It entered it gradually, carrying with it a much older ability to live without it. Looking back toward the beginning of human life helps make this final step clearer. The earliest humans did not wake into a world organized around meals. They woke into uncertainty, into environments where food could not be guaranteed, where timing shifted, and where the day remained open. Hunger was not a signal tied to a repeated hour. It was part of a changing internal state that moved with effort, with prior intake, and with the simple fact that the next opportunity might come soon, or might come later. Eating followed the world, not the clock. Over many generations, this created a body that could continue through variation, a body that did not require perfect spacing in order to function, and a body that could remain active even when the pattern of intake was uneven. As human life changed layer by layer, this older pattern was not replaced all at once. Agriculture brought food closer to predictability, but did not remove uncertainty. Storage allowed food to be held across time, but did not immediately make it stable enough for strict daily division. Timekeeping gave the day clearer edges, but did not instantly shape every part of life. Organized labor finally pulled these elements together, creating a world where food, time, and daily routine could align strongly enough to support repeated meals at fixed hours. Only when these conditions became common did 3 meals begin to feel like the natural structure of the day. Even then, the body beneath this structure remained what it had always been, shaped in a much longer past where such order did not exist. This is why the modern pattern can feel both natural and constructed at the same time. It is natural in the sense that the body can adapt to it, learn it, and live within it comfortably. It is constructed in the sense that it depends on systems that were not present for most of human history. The two truths do not cancel each other. They sit together, forming a quiet balance between adaptation and origin. This balance becomes easier to notice when the pattern changes. A delayed meal does not immediately break the body. A missed meal does not erase the ability to continue. The day can stretch, compress, or shift without losing its meaning entirely. These small observations point back to the deeper flexibility that still exists beneath the modern routine. They suggest that the body is not entirely defined by the schedule it now follows. Seen from this longer view, the question that opened this journey does not lead to a simple conclusion. It leads to a wider understanding. Fixed meals are part of the world people have built, a way of organizing time, labor, and food into something stable and repeatable. But the human body carries a longer memory, one formed in a world where eating was not fixed, where the day was not divided in advance, and where survival depended on the ability to continue without knowing exactly when the next moment of eating would arrive. And so the question remains, quietly, without needing a final answer. If most of human history unfolded without 3 fixed meals, and if the body was shaped in that open and changing world, then what does it mean that today, eating has become something so regular that it feels as though it had always been there? When the question is allowed to rest without being forced into a final answer, a quieter understanding begins to take shape, one that does not ask whether fixed meals are correct or incorrect, but instead asks how they came to feel so certain. The modern day moves in a smooth sequence. Food appears when expected. Hunger seems to follow that expectation. The rhythm repeats so often that it begins to feel complete, as if nothing important exists outside of it. Yet this sense of completeness depends on conditions that are carefully maintained. Food must remain accessible, time must remain organized, daily life must continue to follow a shared pattern. When these conditions hold, the day feels stable. But when they loosen, even slightly, another layer of experience becomes visible, one that does not rely entirely on fixed moments. A delayed meal can stretch the day without breaking it. Hunger can rise, soften, and return in ways that do not always match the clock. The body continues, not because it is ignoring the schedule, but because it carries a deeper rhythm that does not depend entirely on that schedule. Looking back toward the beginning of human life helps bring this deeper rhythm into view. The earliest humans did not live inside systems designed to provide steady repetition. They lived inside environments that changed from day to day, from place to place, and from season to season. Food could not be summoned by the hour. It had to be found, gathered, or shared, and its timing followed conditions beyond human control. In that world, the body learned to remain present across uncertainty. It learned to use what was available and to continue when availability shifted. This did not create a life without pattern, but it created a pattern that remained open, one that could expand and contract without losing its continuity. As human societies gradually introduced agriculture, storage, timekeeping, and structured labor, this openness began to narrow. The day became more predictable, food became more stable, meals became more regular. Over time, this regularity settled into habit, and habit settled into expectation. The body adapted to that expectation, aligning appetite with repeated hours and finding ease in the steady rhythm that modern life provides. Yet the deeper rhythm beneath this adaptation did not disappear. It remained quiet and patient, shaped by a much longer past. This is why the modern pattern can feel both secure and slightly incomplete at the same time. It offers order, but it rests on a body that was not originally formed by that order. The difference is subtle, and it does not need to be resolved. It simply exists as part of the human condition, a layering of history within the present. Even now, across different cultures and ways of life, eating patterns continue to vary. Some people follow 3 fixed meals closely. Others shift the timing or number of meals. Some days remain structured, while others become more open. This variation reflects not only modern choice, but the underlying flexibility that has always been part of human life. The body is able to live inside different patterns because it was shaped in a world where no single pattern dominated every day. Seen from this longer view, fixed meals become easier to understand as one expression of a broader human capacity rather than as a fixed rule written into the body from the beginning. They are a way of organizing life that works within certain conditions, not the only way the body can exist. And when this is understood, the question that began this journey can be left open, not as a problem to solve, but as a quiet reflection. If the body carries both the memory of variation and the habit of regularity, then perhaps the meaning of eating does not belong entirely to the clock, nor entirely to the past, but somewhere in between, where the present continues to move forward while still holding traces of the long and changing path that brought it here. At the very end of this path, what remains is not a correction, not a rule to follow, and not a simple conclusion about how humans should eat, but a quieter recognition of how much of daily life is shaped by layers that arrived at different times. The body carries a very long history, one that began in environments where food could not be scheduled, where the day remained open, and where survival depended on the ability to continue without knowing exactly when the next opportunity to eat would appear. That history did not leave behind a strict timetable. It left behind a capacity, the ability to move through uncertainty, to adjust when patterns change, and to remain steady even when the rhythm of intake is not perfectly regular. Much later, human life began to build something new on top of that capacity. Food became easier to produce, easier to store, easier to access. Time became measurable, repeatable, and shared across large groups of people. Work became structured. Days became organized. Meals found fixed positions inside that organized day. And over time, those positions became so familiar that they started to feel like the original design of the body itself. Yet the longer view suggests something different. The order came later. The body came first. What now feels like a permanent structure may be a surface, stable and useful, but still resting on a deeper foundation that formed under very different conditions. This does not make modern patterns fragile or wrong. It simply places them in time. It shows that the 3 meals many people follow each day are part of a particular world, one shaped by stability, coordination, and control, rather than a direct continuation of the earliest human experience. When this is seen clearly, the question at the beginning does not need to be answered in a fixed way. It can remain open, because it is not only about food. It is about how humans understand what feels natural. Something repeated often enough begins to feel permanent. Something shared widely begins to feel universal. But the deeper human story moves more slowly than habit, and it often holds onto older patterns beneath newer ones without announcing the difference. Even now, in a world of regular meals, the body can still pass through delay, still adjust to change, still continue without perfect timing. These are small, quiet signs that the older history has not disappeared. It remains present, not as a memory we can recall, but as a way the body continues to exist. And so the question does not close. It softens. If most of human history unfolded without 3 fixed meals, and if the body was shaped within that long open pattern, then perhaps what feels natural today is only one version of human life, a version that works within the present world, but not the only way the body has ever known how to move through a day, leaving behind a final thought that does not demand an answer, but simply lingers. If the body can live both inside structure and beyond it, then where, quietly, does its true rhythm begin?